Over to you, Bahar.
Okay, excellent. Hello, everyone. So we have another very exciting talk from Beth Redbird, who'll be joining us from Northwestern University. I'll just put Beth for you. Beth, do you mind sharing your slides so that we can see your presentation as well? So we've been talking about the uncertainties around COVID-19 and the fear that's been causing in the US. And Beth is going to give us a bit more sociological perspective as well on all these matters, and you talk about impact of COVID on community attachments. So over to you, Beth.
Hi, I just got introduced as exciting. I don't know if I'll live up to that, but we'll give it our all. I wanted to talk today about the thing that I think, at least from a sociological perspective, we see the biggest movement on in the kind of evolving pandemic here in the United States. And to give you a bit of background, first I'm going to go through the data set that we're working from, and then I'll talk a little bit about trends that we see in that data set. I do want to kind of preface this by, we're still in the field. We're collecting data all the time. And so what that means is that I'll give you a little bit of data, but unfortunately we're not at the stage where we're doing complex modeling or anything like that on these results yet. We're working with the COVID-19 social change survey, and this survey came about, it started the week of March 11th, because myself and several affiliated faculty here at Northwestern in Chicago, our lives changed so fast. And because that change occurred, we were starting to think that maybe we had this sort of social obligation to ensure that as our lives changed this fast, that other people's lives and the change in those lives were documented and preserved for future research. And so the COVID Social Change Survey launched on March 11th and has been in the field kind of routinely since that point. It's a nationally representative survey with an oversample of Americans over age 55. It's administered daily, and it's a panel survey. And we use the internet, of course, because modern things being what they are, and also the pandemic. So let me explain a bit about what that means, and then I'll give you some mildly interesting results. So we're in the field daily, and we thought this was really important because of how fast life changed. And so this allows us to do time series analyses to capture changes that occur very quickly. And as you can see, for instance, how serious a threat is COVID-19 to your health? Daily change has been a thing. The pandemic moves fast here, and the result of that is that opinion and attitude change very fast. We're nationally representative, which means we're all over the place. This allows us to do some context analysis and, like your previous speaker, some multi-level analysis. We're also a panel survey, so we're trying to enable some causal inference. And so what happens is we're in the field for 6 weeks and we survey about 8,000 people. And then at the end of 6 weeks, we pivot and we return and we survey those 8,000 people again. We just finished our second wave and we're about to launch our third wave, and we're hoping to do a fourth wave in October, a fifth wave right after the election, and a sixth wave in January. So we will hope that we're successful in that endeavor. The survey covers a whole host of primarily social and cultural topics. So for instance, health and stress, risk, emotion, uncertainty and time preference, knowledge and media use, information exchange networks, trust. It covers household response, including preparation and social distancing behaviors and time use. It also covers people's views of agency response and trusted institutions, social and community engagement. We're going to try and have ourselves an election model since we happen to be in the middle of an election as well. The ultimate second pandemic is a US election. We have financial well-being and work, including job and income change, employer response, resource exchange, public policy response, and some stuff about federalism. We also have family and household stuff, including migration, quality of family relationships, childcare, homeschooling, school response, and some basic demographics. We have a wide selection of survey topics. And so I want to give you just a few kind of fun preliminary results this morning, particularly in the question of community attachment and what that means. So to give you a bit of background, institutions often have, they're sticky. They often have historical paths or trajectories that are difficult to offer. And so what happens then is occasionally we end up in this period in which sociologists would call critical juncture. It's a period of uncertainty, right, that facilitates institutional change. In periods of large social disruption, right, we note that because we're experiencing this disruption, our institutions must have failed us. And that opens us to the question of whether or not we should be making large institutional changes. So for example, let's ask, firstly, do we think the United States is in the middle of a critical juncture? So are we questioning our institutions? And so we have a scale in the survey of a bunch of items that ask about how you would compare United States institutions to other nations in the world. It's a US exceptionalism scale. What Max Boot called America's pre-existing condition is US exceptionalism. And so we ask how people feel about these various institutions, and it's a fine scale. It functions fine as a scale. And you can see over the last 3.5 months, there's been this general decline in the belief of US exceptionalism. Now, I want to note something about the trend line here. The trend line is not a model with any controls. It's simply a model with a nonlinear time component in it. And then you can see the error bars. So it doesn't contain demographic controls or anything like that. So you can see this kind of general decline in the belief in US exceptionalism over the past 3 months. And this, of course, kind of disguises some variation. So for instance, if we looked at the US healthcare system, which was always kind of not well regarded at the beginning of the study, we see some decline, of course, in the belief in US healthcare system, which is perhaps not surprising. We also see kind of a comparable declining support for the economy, which these are two institutions that were really heavily hit by the pandemic. But we can also kind of see this problem in non-pandemic related institutions. So for instance, decline in the exceptionalism around the US military. Now, we did have some prominent stories of cases on battle carriers and in military installations, but we also see kind of declining support for criminal justice. Now, I want to note, please note here, like the death of George Floyd is murdered here. So the declining support for criminal justice system begins before that prominent media event. Right. And so what happens here is we can see like this isn't limited to these big institutions. How would you say you have experienced trust in scientific experts, right? So trust in science is another institution. And again, declining over the point of the pandemic, which I actually found to be really discouraging, but people very rarely ask me what I want. And so this decline here is again disguising a lot of internal variation. So for instance, how trustworthy would you say conclusions are drawn by scientists in the following area? And we can see, of course, there's a lot of disparity. So for instance, eating healthy is definitely regarded as a more scientific endeavor, something we trust scientists on more. So is space exploration, so is treating depression, right? But when we start to get down here to a couple of places, first off, we see kind of the economy is generally not regarded as something that scientists draw trustworthy conclusions about. Climate change is also slightly lower on the scale, and then COVID is down there too. In other words, we're not regarding COVID as this thing that we feel like science is drawing conclusions about. There's big partisan differences in some of these. So for instance, here's partisan differences on eating healthy and space exploration and treating depression and things, right? Here's partisan differences in growing the economy. Climate change, of course, in the United States, a highly politicized topic, right? And so here's the Republican Democratic difference in trustworthiness of conclusions on climate change. And then here's COVID, right? Which has also been highly politicized here. And so again, we see kind of this declining faith in institutions, right? And some of this has been stable. For instance, whether or not scientists are trustworthy on drawing conclusions about eating healthy has been somewhat stable over this period of time. That's not true of, say, trust in dealing with the coronavirus, in which science and trust in science has eroded over the last 6 weeks. The same is true of Democrats, right? So Democrats have experienced this kind of general increase trust in science surrounding the coronavirus, but Republicans have experienced this decrease. They start out at a lower level of trust and it declines over the pandemic. So one of the things that happens is when these institutions face this period of intense turmoil, other questions start to arise. For instance, we start to wonder about political parties who are responsible for building and maintaining these institutions. And we start to wonder when they may not be providing us with credible answers. And so let's next ask, are we losing trust in established political parties, right? So some of you might remember after the Great Recession and the bank bailouts there, we experienced another period of time in which we really started to question our political parties. And the result of that was in part the rise of the Tea Party. Now, what would eventually happen with the Tea Party and its eventual trajectory would become very complicated, but it starts out from this position of sort of questioning whether or not the traditional Republican Party was doing what it was supposed to do for its constituents. Right. So again, we have kind of this set of questions, and some of them that we ask is what traits would you use to describe either Republican Party or the Democratic Party? And they include things like patriotic, mean, intelligent, honest, selfish, open-minded, generous, hypocritical, or places party above country, right? We compile these into another scale, and we can see, for instance, that over the course of the pandemic, we are far more likely to describe the Republican Party less positively, right? And so the items that are positive on that scale have declined, and we've increased negative responses on that scale, right? Compare that, of course, to like within that scale, patriotic has declined significantly, right? We also see a decline in honesty, whether or not we describe the Republican Party as honest, whether or not we describe the Republican Party as intelligent, right? Whether or not we describe the Republican Party as hypocritical. Let's contrast that now with the Democratic Party, which has also experienced a slight decline, but it's been non-significant. In other words, there's evidence of some stability here in our view of the Democratic Party, right? Including honest and intelligent and hypocritical. And so while we see that maybe we're questioning a political party, we're not necessarily questioning both political parties. What's really interesting about this, though, is, for instance, here is the average response on the Democratic Party. Again, stable over time, right? But here's the average Democratic response on the Republican Party. Now, again, it's really unsurprising that with Republicans, like with Democrats, Republicans are underwater, right? Democrats are far less favorable to Republicans in general. Over the course of the pandemic, Democrats have become far less favorable to Republicans. Let's look at the Republican Party now, right? Unsurprisingly, the Republican Party is more favorable of the Republican Party, right? But over the course of the pandemic, that favorability has declined even amongst Republicans. Contrast that with Republican views of the Democratic Party, and we can see, like, again, Democrats have been stable about their view of other Democrats, right? Republicans have increased their view of Democrats over this period of time. So in other words, while we're experiencing a declining faith in the Republican Party, that declining faith, again, hides a lot of variation in that both parties are experiencing declining faith in the Republican Party. And both parties are experiencing either an increased faith or a stable faith in the Democratic Party, right? Which definitely suggests that it's not just a partisan split. It's not just, I don't like the word, but it's not just tribalism and tribal politics. Instead, what it is it's an actual shift in faith around whether or not these political parties are doing what we feel like they need to do. So why do we necessarily care about faith in political parties? And the answer for that comes from when we hit these crisis of failure turning points, we're often more open to change. In other words, because we've now experienced both this question about whether or not our institutions are doing what they're supposed to, and whether or not our leaders are capable of reforming those institutions in the way they should, what comes out of that is this willingness to change the status quo. In other words, what seemed natural or reasonable or things that we took for granted suddenly become questioned, right? In other words, a critical juncture leads us to the willingness to reform or collapse existing social or political or economic institutions, right? And so the net result of that is we see this, right? We see large requests for institutional change. And so I would make the argument to you that not only were widespread protests in the United States a highly likely event, given the way we're feeling about our institutions and our leaders who should be reforming those institutions, but on top of that, the fact that this request for change doesn't directly relate to the pandemic is also not surprising, right? Now, this is not to say that the disputes and requests around criminal justice reform are not a long time coming, because they absolutely are, right? A racial reckoning around criminal justice in the United States has been needed for a long time. What instead I'm suggesting is that we could have experienced protests in the United States on this scale around any number of institutions. They didn't have to be related to the pandemic, because that's what critical juncture does for us. It allows us to question things we thought were stable. And you can see this a little bit in the public opinion polling around race and policing, right? A year ago, less than 40% of Americans thought police were harder on people of color. Today, that number's in the high 60%. Right? And for those of you who are familiar with public opinion polling, you know a 24% change in public opinion over the span of a year is a huge shift. Right? This is us questioning our existing cultural order and our willingness to make changes to the status quo. Okay, so what does this have to do with community and how we understand community, right? So let's ask a little bit about how are Americans understanding one another, and are we pulling together, right? So much has been made in the United States about the kind of rally around the flag effect, this idea that after a period of disaster, we find this to be somewhat unifying and create solidarity. So for instance, after 9/11, right, George W. Bush experiences this huge increase in public approval, right? It lasts for about a year and a half, right? A similar effect, but much, much smaller, occurs in the United States, right? Here's Trump's rally around the flag effect. It's about 3 percentage points. It lasts only 2 weeks. So how do we understand this shift, right? Disasters are supposed to be unifying. They're supposed to look like this. Why does this look like this, right? So we ask a social solidarity scale, which basically asks questions about like how connected we are to our community, our neighbors, and our world, right? And what we can see over the period of the pandemic is that we've actually experienced this big decline in social solidarity, right? We don't feel more connected to one another. Now, this might be the result of the unique aspects of the pandemic. So for instance, the pandemic asked us to separate ourselves. Shelter at home and social distancing orders specifically ask us to avoid one another. In addition, the pandemic makes our neighbors dangerous to us, right? So in the pandemic, it's not just our own decisions, it's decisions of people around us that put ourselves and our families at risk. Right, so those two things that are unique about the pandemic might be leading to this general decline in social solidarity. Or social solidarity might be relating to kind of this understanding of the status quo and the fact that our institutions are failing us. So for instance, we can ask, do Americans tend to come together in a time of crisis? And we see declining support for that, right? My neighbors would help me if I needed it, declines over time, as does I'm deeply connected to my community, right? And so out of this change in social solidarity, we should be asking ourselves, what do we expect in the future? So for those of you who are old enough to remember post 9/11 United States, in post 9/11 United States, we get a whole bunch of policy changes that result. And those policy changes are kind of disavowed today, and politicians run away from the decisions they made at the time. But there was huge, broad, sweeping support for things like the Defense Authorization Act that kind of put us in this ability to create perpetual wars, right? We get US civilian surveillance in the NSA out of this time. We even get the Academic Freedom Act out of this time, right? So we get these big policy shifts that people supported at the time, and now we kind of wish we hadn't. And those come out of this increased period of social solidarity where we're experiencing increased attachment to our country and increased fear about something, right? And so the net result of this is these big policy shifts. So let's ask, can we expect today to see support for big policy shifts in the United States, right? So for instance, questions have been had about whether or not they'll start to use broad scale cell phone monitoring to track COVID. And do Americans support this? So we have a whole battery of questions about what kind of policies the government should implement, right? And we tried to construct these ranging from kind of things that we knew the government was going to do at the beginning of March. Like we'd already started closing a few schools and a few businesses and canceling a few large events. So we thought it was likely that those things would happen. We tried to be a little bit more broad than that and ask like, would we restrict travel and things like that? And then we tried to be a little crazy and guess at things that we thought would no way happen, like postponing elections. And I'm afraid to say we missed the mark a little bit and that we clearly should have thought a little crazier because all of the things on our list started to be discussed in the public policy realm, at least to some extent. And you can see over time, we actually experienced kind of early in the pandemic, a slight increased willingness to constrain freedoms. And then that willingness drops off substantially. Right. And so in other words, like that's true kind of across the board. Should Americans be forced to get the vaccine once it's developed? Right. A slight uptick around the beginning of the pandemic that declined substantially after that. Right. Should we force Americans to take a test to determine if they're infected? Shows a similar pattern. Right. Should we force Americans who've had contact with COVID to quarantine in a medical facility? Should we force Americans to stay home for 24 hours for 2 weeks at a time? Like this kind of still same pattern. And what we've discovered is that that pattern matches really well. Oh, for those of you who are curious, the answer is cell phone data has the same pattern, but nobody ever supports cell phone GPS tracking. Like nobody likes it. This pattern here really matches well with, I think, what your past speaker was talking about, which is worry and fear. In other words, it tracks how worried people were about the pandemic. Early in March, the people are far more worried about the social and economic disruptions of the pandemic, and they become more worried about getting sick in the pandemic in early April and late April, and by May, that worry starts to dissipate. And this is the exact track that questions of policy also take. We're willing to constrain our freedoms in April, and by May, that support has gone away, right? We're no longer willing to postpone elections. We're no longer willing to keep citizens from returning from abroad, right? And it tracks worry. All right. So what that means is that while we see this like this supporting change for institutions and this questioning of our institutions, we're not necessarily funneling that into support for broad scale policies that directly impact the pandemic. So how will we know whether or not we should expect large scale policy changes to be supported in kind of the post-pandemic era? And what social theorists, particularly historical comparative people who study institutions, will tell us is that critical junctures create large scale change in two specific conditions. The first is a time when there's a relatively short period of time between the crisis in question and the ability to create change. In other words, we want, like, change is more likely to occur if there's a short period of time between when we question that status quo and when we're able to make the policy change. And the second is that there is way more likely to experience change in a period of time when the agent's choice has a high probability of impacting the outcome. In other words, when people can actually demand change in the status quo and expect to see it succeed. That's when we're more likely to demand it, and that's when it's more likely to succeed. And so the question is, will the pandemic create kind of a sustained policy change, right? And the answer is probably. At least that would be my guess, right? We're in the middle of a very unique period in that this is an election year. In other words, this is a period of time in which we can, in a short order, relatively close to the pandemic, as it's very little evidence the United States pandemic will be over by November, we can demand change. And more specifically, we feel like that change has a higher probability of creating actual difference. All right. So you can explore our data. We're about to finish, we just got done with wave 2, so we're about to post it on there. I hope to have it posted in the next week. So you can go and explore it, and it gives you the opportunity to kind of dig around in it and enjoy all 250 questions that we subject our participants to. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Beth. I think you've fully lived up to the exciting talk build-up that I made.
Thank you.
I found it very thought-provoking, and I don't know if you personally had a chance to join some of the other talks during this conference, but there were so many overlaps and bridges that we can build that tie really nicely into the theme of the conference as well. So a couple of the ones that I would like to highlight: on the first day, we had talk by Hansika Kapoor and Anirudh Taga, who were analyzing an international database looking at collectivism and individualism, and more correctly, the distance from the US and how this influences people's behaviors and worries around COVID. And it was speaking very nicely into the pattern you were showing as well about how people in the US were quite worried, but also at the same time opposed to the restrictions and didn't want their freedom of right to be taken away from them. One question I have for you is, you answered it to some extent. Another parallel was with Ben Kenwood's talk earlier today, which was focusing on climate change, people's attitude towards climate change. And his data based on a UK and a US sample shows that even the conservative voters in the UK are more approaching climate change related policies more positively. So it speaks a bit towards the conclusions you were making about, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, about how social change can occur once people start questioning, once the trust is broken with the status quo, and once people are in search of different bonds to build, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think the big, of course, question that we all want to know is, to what extent is any of this permanent? And how do we understand what creates sustained social change? And I think that the answer is that the pandemic definitely is creating the potential for large scale change in the US. What form that will take, I mean, that's the nature of critical juncture theory, is the form of that might actually seem really indirect, right? It might seem like, why are we demanding criminal justice reform in the middle of a pandemic when we should be requiring health care reform or something like that? And the answer is that it's all about this question of when your society should be capable of serving you, and when you trust it, and when you start to question its competence.
Yeah. Another, there's some very nice comments. You might want to check them out as well on the live stream. One of them is by Jayant Narayanan, who says he found the finding about the decline in social solidarity shocking, because in Singapore, where they are living, they see the opposite pattern. I wonder what you would say about that.
I think that's fascinating. I don't know the answer to that. Of course, Singapore has been closer to more recent experiences of outbreak and pandemic than the United States has been. We've been we're acting like this is our first experience. It's not, because we had a little bit of SARS and things, but we're acting like this is our first experience ever in the United States in 100 years. But so I think that maybe the question of shelter apart is not quite as new in other places as it is in the United States. I don't know. Like your past speaker, I would invite people to contact me because we're happy to, like, particularly in the comparative sense, to pair our data with other places and let's see what's going on, because it's endlessly fascinating. Yeah.
Just on that point, may I ask you to put the, well, there's one specific question that this might be a very quick question for you. Somebody's asking which specific scale you use to measure solidarity. And yeah, I'll just.
We combined a couple of them.
Okay.
Yeah.
I wondered if you'd be happy to put the link to your data, the one you put at the end of our whiteboard. I think it might be very helpful for people to go back and see it and contact you if they would like to engage in some collaborations. There's another question which I'm just going to raise, but I will actually have to switch to the next speaker because we're running out of time, sadly. But Rachel Sumner says, the idea of US exceptionalism is so fascinating. I wonder how national exceptionalism and personal exceptionalism intersect, just as she loved your talk.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think we might actually have the ability to pull that out and tease that out in our data, though I haven't looked at it. Yeah.
That's excellent. So we'll keep an eye on your upcoming work. Thank you so much for taking part. It has been a pleasure.